Hey there, welcome. Thanks for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about the 8 best supplements for hybrid athletes. And really, this is the list of supplements that, in my opinion, based on the evidence, are the most effective for the purpose of improving exercise performance. The list we're going to go through isn't necessarily in order of what I think is best, most effective to worst, least effective, nor am I making this video and the accompanying article to recommend all 8 supplements for you. More likely, some combination of the 8 supplements in here is going to be a smart combination for you based on your goals, your training, and all that sort of stuff. As we go through, I'll talk about, who each supplement might be best for and when you might want to use each one. So hopefully you get a better idea. Furthermore, I don't necessarily intend to go very deep into, the background of each individual supplement, as, for most of these I have in a specific article and video already doing that. I'll link that down below if any of these particularly catch your eye. And really, in my opinion, one of the best parts about this list is these really don't tend to be expensive supplements, which is a change from what you see most commonly marketed, on social media and whatnot. So broadly speaking, this is the list of supplements that I plan to cover in this video. Some of these you might have heard of, some of these you may not have heard of, some of these you may have heard of, but they're commonly used wrong. An example is beta-alanine, and I'll talk about why that is once we get into that specific slide. Each supplement here, I have a reference, a paper to support. I'll add a slide of the formal citations at the end of this video, as well as the links to the papers in the description box below if you're interested in digging deeper in that way. So with that said, let's get right into the first one. And again, when I say first one, this is just the first one I'm going to talk about, not necessarily my first on the list. It might be first on the list for you depending on training. It might not be. These aren't in any order because I don't know you. I can't really give you a good order. Nevertheless, beta-alanine is a supplement that is very commonly found in pre-workout products. The problem is that it really has no business being in a pre-workout supplement. Reason being is that there is no acute effect. In other words, there is no you take beta-alanine and 30 to 60 minutes later, you feel the effect. It doesn't necessarily work like that. I'll explain that more when we talk about how much and when to take it, but I bring that up to say that when I say beta-alanine here, I'm not necessarily recommending it, in the form of a pre-workout supplement. I'm more recommending it as a standalone product if you decide that this is something worthwhile for you. So beta-alanine is something you take that, as the digestive process continues, is converted into carnosine, and that carnosine is stored in your muscles. And it's this carnosine, this other compound, that really exerts the effect. The reason you don't supplement with carnosine specifically is because it wouldn't survive the stomach acid. So when you perform high intensity conditioning type of exercise, think hitting fatigue within 1 to 4 minutes or so, there's a buildup of acid that occurs within the working muscles. This buildup of acid can inhibit further energy production as well as further muscle contraction. Both bad things for performance. Carnosine acts as a buffer. It's a base that buffers this acid buildup, prolongs that acid-induced fatigue, and improves performance in any of those relevant activities. So when I say, fatigue within 1 to 4 minutes of time, examples of that could be an 800 meter or half mile run for max effort, a 50 to 100 meter max effort swim, or even just a high rep set of weightlifting. But in any case, any activity in which you're hitting fatigue or getting near fatigue within that 1 to 4-ish minute time frame, beta-alanine is going to benefit. And as another example, I just thought of to hopefully make this more clear before we move on. Say you were doing an interval workout where you're doing 2 minutes of easy running, 2 minutes of hard running, and you repeat that 3 to 5 times or something like that. Those 2 to 5 minute hard intervals would be benefited from beta-alanine. So broadly speaking, that's the sort of stuff it's going to help. If you have in your training program training of that sort, then beta-alanine may be a good supplement for you. And typically, if you do consider yourself, a hybrid athlete or someone who pursues strength and endurance at the same time, most endurance training programs are going to have some sort of mix of high volume, easy type of endurance training, as well as low volume, high intensity type of training, i.e. the sort of stuff beta-alanine would benefit. It's likely this would be a supplement worthwhile to be on your radar. As far as how much to take, most research has suggested 3.2 to 6.4 grams of beta-alanine per day. To my knowledge, there's not much evidence looking at if there's any sort of body weight dependence on that, but I think it'd be reasonable to infer that there probably is. So if you're someone who is on the lighter side as far as body weight goes, maybe 3.2 would be fine. If you're someone who's on the heavier side, maybe 6.4 would be better. As far as when to take it, it doesn't really matter as long as you take it every day. So as we said before, beta-alanine is converted into carnosine, and that carnosine is stored in the muscles. That carnosine has to saturate within your muscles, for lack of a better word, and that takes time. If I remember correctly off the top of my head, I believe it's about 4 to 6 weeks of daily beta-alanine supplementation that it takes to get to that full carnosine saturation within your muscles and, therefore experience the full spectrum of the benefits of beta-alanine supplementation. So, that said, it doesn't really matter what time of day you take it, as long as you take it every day. Now, there's something to be said about a split, a 2-a-day dose schedule, i.e., say you're going to take 6.4 grams of beta-alanine per day. Taking a split dose would be a 3.2 in the morning, 3.2 at night. There's some stuff to say that it might be better. I don't think it's a huge consideration, as far as effectiveness goes. But a common side effect of beta-alanine is a sense of paresthesia, or numbness or tingling in your arms or legs. This isn't necessarily dangerous or harmful in any way. It's just a thing that may happen. It's also, a thing that happens that tends to subside with habituation. So, the more you take it, the more your body gets used to beta-alanine, but the less likely it's going to continue to happen. Nevertheless, if it's something you want to sidestep just because you want to avoid it, a split dose strategy where you're taking smaller doses 2 times a day as opposed to one bigger dose 1 time a day may help you do that. But really, I would consider that more of a personal preference thing as opposed to an effectiveness thing. So next up is creatine, which really is the supplement that seems to be talked about the most. If I was going to have a number one recommendation on this list, creatine would probably be it, just because of the magnitude of the benefit it tends to deliver, as well as the width of benefit that it tends to deliver. So there's 3 main energy systems within your body, systems that produce energy for your body to function, one of which is known as the creatine phosphate system. And this is an energy system that can produce energy very quickly, but it can't last for very long. Think of things like a heavy squat, a max effort sprint, things like that. The limiting factor to this energy system is usually the amount of creatine within your muscles. Most people hover around 60% creatine saturation within their muscles at any given point in time. And so one of the reasons why you can't, you sprint for 10 seconds and you start to, severely putter out is because those creatine stores run out. Creatine is made naturally in the body, and it is found in food like meat and fish and stuff like that. But you'd have to eat something like 3 pounds of red meat to get, to saturate your muscles with creatine from food alone. So supplementation makes it much easier. Creatine also does tend to suck more water into your muscles, i.e. improve your hydration status. So there could be something to be said about if you're someone who is doing exercise that makes you sweat a lot, such as endurance training. So more commonly, this is recommended for strength and power type endeavors, but I do think there is enough of a rationale to say that there's probably going to be a benefit to endurance training as well. There's a lot of stuff coming out now on cognitive benefits and improvements in cognition in general, but this tends to only occur in states in which your cognition would be otherwise impacted. So sleep deprivation is kind of the most famous example of that. Advanced age is another example, but things like that, things where there are external factors inhibiting your cognitive facilities, creatine is likely to help with. As far as how much to take, my recommendation is still the classic 5 grams per day. You'll see a lot of people online recommending 10 to 15 grams per day, but I'm really not quite there myself. If you're interested why, comment below and I'll let you know, but I'm more confident that you'll get 99% of the benefits just taking 5 grams per day. As far as when to take it, again, it does not really matter as long as you take it every day at some point, because creatine has to saturate within your muscles. Remember, most people sit around 60% creatine saturation at baseline, and the point of creatine supplementation is to get to 100% saturations. Does not, and that takes about 4 weeks if I remember correctly. So it doesn't matter when you take it as long as you take it every day. And if you miss a day, it's probably fine. The washout period. So washout period is, say someone is at 100% creatine saturation. The washout period would be when they get back to normal baseline values after stopping creatine supplementation. It takes about 30 days, if I remember correctly, for that to happen. So if you miss 1 day, if you miss 2 days, it's probably fine. So next up, sodium bicarbonate. Very few people tend to know about this one, but it really does tend to have a big impact on the type of exercise that it helps. So what it does, sodium bicarbonate is a strong base. So it's going to do the same thing pretty much that beta-alanine does, but it buffers the acid buildup in a different compartment of the body. And the result is that it tends to help different durations of exercise. Most of the research shows that sodium bicarbonate supplementation will help exercise that lasts somewhere like 30 seconds to 12 minutes or so. I'm giving you kind of hard numbers here, but it's going to vary person to person. But at least as far as what the evidence has shown, or anytime you're fatiguing within 30 seconds to 12 minutes, which is a pretty wide range, sodium bicarbonate is going to benefit. And I mentioned at the beginning of this video that most of the supplements on this list are pretty cheap, and sodium bicarbonate is the poster child of that. It's even inflation adjusted, it's practically free. So as far as who should take it, I would say the same sort of guidelines for beta-alanine, but with a wider range. If you have any kind of high conditioning, really of any sort in your programming, you probably do, sodium bicarbonate is probably going to help you out. As far as how much to take, the commonly recommended dose is 0.2 to 0.5 grams per kilogram of body mass. So, identify how much you weigh in kilograms, multiply that by 0.2 for the low end and 0.5 for the high end. And I'll talk about, why I put precautions here right now. I highly recommend you start with the 0.2 end of the spectrum, because if you take too much, or if you take it, too early to the onset of exercise, it can cause some gnarly gastric distress. So, think nausea and pooping yourself during exercise. Not good. So if you're interested in experimenting with this, start with 0.2 grams per kilogram. Take it somewhere between 60 to 120, so 1 hour to 2 hours before the onset of exercise. See how you feel, and then, don't play with the, when you take it, still take it 1 to 2 hours before long term. But if you feel good at 0.2 grams per kilogram, then you can, increase that to 0.3, 0.4. And I highly recommend getting a food scale so you're accurate with this and you don't mess this up. So protein powder, another obvious one, but it is impactful enough to make the list. Now, the purpose of protein powder is really just to help you hit your protein target needs. Protein as a macronutrient tends to be more filling, take longer to prep, sometimes more expensive. So protein powder can just be an easy way to hit that target with, a little bit less effort. And for all intents and purposes, I commonly recommend people view protein powder less as a supplement and more just as a food, more just as an isolated macronutrient. As far as, how much protein you need in a day, I'm typically recommending 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. So, again, I believe in pounds, I think that's 0.81 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So if you weigh 100 pounds, that's 81 grams. If you weigh 200 pounds, that's 162 grams, and, do the math as needed. So something you could do is identify how much protein you're eating with your current days of eating. Increase that as you're able to with food. If there's a discrepancy between your current day of eating and what your protein needs are based on that 0.81 per pound body weight. And then any discrepancy that remains, you can fill in with protein powder just to make things easier. As far as what kind to take, if you have no allergy, aversion, intolerance, etc., anything like that to dairy, then you're going to want to go with whey protein. It is the highest quality kind of protein you can buy. It is generally the best tasting as far as protein powder goes, and it checks all the boxes that you might want to check. Whey protein powder tends to come in the form of a concentrate, isolate, and hydrolysate. Really, the only difference is that they vary by 1 or 2 grams of carbs or fats. Makes no difference fundamentally. So, just go with the one that is third-party tested, which I'll talk about a bit later in this video, and tastes the best, quite honestly. So next up, beetroot and nitrate supplements. This is one less people know about. Kind of newer, you could say. The evidence is growing, but it's very promising. And I am close to saying that if I was going to have a number 2 recommendation, let's say number 3, because protein would probably be number 2. If I was going to have a number 3, this very likely would be number 3. So what it does, what do nitrates do? Nitrates, when you eat them, are converted into nitrites and nitric oxide at various points in the digestive process. Nitric oxide is what's called a vasodilator. So it just makes your blood vessels wider, and it makes blood, oxygen, and nutrients and that sort of good stuff, makes that easier for that stuff to flow into the working muscles. Most aerobic endurance type activity is limited by the amount of oxygen you can get into the working muscles and put to use. VO2 max, one of the more common measures of endurance performance and endurance capacity, is a measure of the maximum volume of oxygen you can get into the working muscles. And beetroots are just an easy source to make a supplement out of as a source of nitrates. So that's kind of why I put beetroot / nitrate there. But nevertheless, any type of activity that is limited by oxygen delivery is going to benefit from nitrate supplementation. And when I say limited by oxygen delivery, to make that a bit more clear, you can think of anything that lasts 5 to 6 minutes in duration or longer. Obviously, again, not a hard rule, but it's good enough. Now, as far as who should take it, really anyone who does any kind of endurance training, in my opinion, would benefit from this. Now, there's a lot of papers that came out recently to show, or really to reinforce it, to say that it is the volume of endurance training that drives most of the benefits. In other words, this lower intensity, higher volume, oxygen limited type of exercise is going to drive most of the benefit and accumulating large volumes of that. And so if that is kind of the main player and what you're going to spend most of your time training in endurance training, and that's what this benefits, it seems rational to me to make this kind of a number 3, or even I could say a number 1 as far as endurance specific supplements go. Now, worth mentioning who should not take it. If you are taking sildenafil or Viagra, nitrates are an absolute contraindication, meaning if you're taking that, you should not take nitrates. Reason being is that there might be too much of a vasodilating effect. Your blood pressure might drop too low to a point that is bad. Now, this video is not medical advice, but I thought that was worth mentioning. As far as how much to take, The best dose to me seems to be 400 milligrams per day of nitrates. Higher doses have been tested, but they haven't really shown to have more benefit than 400. So that's kind of my recommendation. As far as when to take it, there are studies looking at pre-workout strategies as well as daily strategies. Both have shown to have benefit, so that suggests that there's probably an acute and a long-term effect. But the daily supplementation strategy tends to outperform just a pre-workout strategies. My current recommendation, as far as how the evidence stands right now, is just to take 400 milligrams per day whenever it is most convenient for you. So next up, and always worth mentioning, is caffeine. And I wanted to put this here because oftentimes when I bring up caffeine, people think I'm talking about pre-workout, and I'm not. I'm talking about caffeine specifically. Pre-workout has caffeine, but pre-workouts typically have many other things. And these many other things in pre-workouts are, in my opinion, marketing more than anything else. 99% of the benefit of any pre-workout supplement is going to come from caffeine. And how you get that caffeine, whether it's a caffeine pill, whether it's coffee, whether it's an energy drink, a pre-workout, I don't think is going to make very much difference at all. So the benefits of caffeine to exercise, there's really two of note that I want to bring up. One's obvious, one is not so obvious. So the obvious one is that it makes you less tired, makes you more alert, increases motivation to train, and all that sort of stuff. And that's really going to have a global effect on all kinds of exercise. The second one is that it may increase your body's ability to use fat for fuel during exercise. So if you were to compare two people running a 5K at max effort, one of which was untrained, one of which was highly trained, the untrained person would use something like 100% of carbohydrate stores to fuel that exercise, whereas the highly trained person would use 50% carbs, 50% fat to fuel that exercise. Those numbers are made up, and it's not going to be perfectly 50-50, 100. But just to illustrate the point that one of the primary adaptations you see in response to an endurance training program is an increased ability to use fat for fuel during exercise. The reason being is that once your carbohydrate stores run out, that's when true physical fatigue tends to set in. So if you can use fat for fuel more efficiently and earlier on in exercise, those carbohydrate stores are going to last longer and fatigue is going to be pushed off. And all that to say that caffeine seems to have that effect, that it'll make you a little bit better at using fat for fuel during exercise and therefore probably push fatigue off a little bit farther. As far as how much to take, really, if you take any amount of caffeine, you're going to see a benefit to taking no caffeine at all. So I think that's worth saying. But my recommendation, as far as maximizing performance in an exercise session, is 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body mass. And again, references for all this I'm listing below. But to put that in perspective, I am about 75 kgs as I am right now. So if I wanted to, take a most potent dose for performance of caffeine, I'd be looking at like 235-ish milligrams of caffeine, or, roughly speaking, give or take. To put that into even more perspective, your average cup of coffee, a measured out cup, has about 100 milligrams or 90, something like that, depends on the brew, of caffeine. So that's like 2.25. And again, whether you took this from a pill, coffee, pre-workout, energy drink, I don't think it's going to matter that much. As far as when to take it, 30 to 60 minutes before the onset of exercise is probably going to be your best bet, because that's going to let all the caffeine get into your bloodstream, and therefore you can see, all the benefits, maximal benefits during your session. Now, caffeine has a half-life of 6 hours, which means that if you were to take 2 milligrams of caffeine right now, straight to the dome, 6 hours later, you would have 100 milligrams of caffeine still in your bloodstream. So it hangs around for a while. And as you might expect, that has implications for your sleep. So commonly you'll hear people say to cessate drinking any caffeine 6 hours before you're planning to go to bed. And that's kind of why, because of that half-life. Now, let's imagine, though, that you're someone who is training in the afternoon, and the 30 to 60 minute prior to onset of exercise time frame that I recommended a minute ago would fall within 6 hours, or that 6 hour time frame before sleep. In other words, the time frame I recommended doesn't work for you. I would say just drink caffeine up until the point where you would need to stop to not impact your sleep too much. Because again, there's still going to be some in your bloodstream when you start exercise later on in the day. So you're still going to get benefits from it. So next up, electrolytes. Now these are a supplement that really has grown in popularity over the past couple of years. And electrolyte, the term electrolyte just refers to any ionically bonded compound that dissolves into its respective ions when placed in water. Kind of boring and completely useless definition, but it describes a large number of compounds in the body. The two that really matter for performance are sodium and potassium, because when you sweat, those are the two primary ones that are lost in that sweat, which is why your sweat tastes salty. Now, sodium and potassium are important for energy production and muscle contraction. So as you sweat more during exercise and you lose more sodium and potassium, your ability to produce energy and to contract your muscles is impaired, among many other things, but the depth of that is not necessarily the point of this video. Real quickly though, just to add one more thing, about why do they matter? Because heat training or training outside, training in the heat is a big reason why you might want to use them. If you lose too much sodium and too much potassium during an endurance training session in the heat stroke becomes much more common, or much more likely, I should say. So really, what I tend to say is any session in which you are sweating a great deal, usually that describes endurance training, certainly greater endurance training greater than 60 minutes, but really I would go as far to say any kind of training that's done outside in the heat. And to reiterate, I think they're important for performance under those conditions, but also for safety. So as far as how much to take, really the sodium potassium would be dissolved in water. And the goal is for that, solution of water to sort of match the sodium and potassium concentration of your blood so that, as you lose that through sweat, you're replacing exactly what you're losing. You're not replacing too much sodium. You're not, diluting the sodium and having too much water, or it should be kind of even to what you're losing. So to really, get within, that sort of area, if you had 10 ounces of water, you're looking at about 500 milligrams of sodium and about 200 milligrams of potassium. And then you just scale that up or down depending on how much water you plan to drink in your session. And now these days, there's no shortage of electrolyte supplementations. There's, LMNT, BPN has their product, etc. And they do tend to taste pretty good, but they are pretty expensive. I mean, because they're just salt. It's expensive salt is what you're buying. Tasty, expensive salt nonetheless, but salt is what it is. So if you wanted to make your own supplement here, that really would cost you pretty much nothing. If you bought just standard table salt and you put a 2-finger pinch of that into 10 ounces of water, then you bought salt substitute, which is just potassium chloride instead of sodium chloride, and you put a 1-finger pinch into 10 ounces of water, you would hit that 500 to 200-ish good enough range, and you'd get pretty much all the benefits that you're going to find from these electrolyte supplements. Probably not going to taste as good, but if you want to pay pretty much nothing, and to really illustrate the difference, that sort of solution will cost you, I measured out the other day, something like 10 cents, for each 10 ounces of water. LMNT is like, I think $2.50. Don't quote me there. I don't have that knowledge off the top of my head, but it's a pretty wild difference. I mean, it's like a 20x multiple. So last one on the list is intra-training carbohydrates, or in other words, supplementing with carbohydrates or sugars really during a training session. So like I said earlier, when your carbohydrate stores run out, that is really when true physical fatigue sets in. So the purpose of supplementing with carbohydrates is to replenish those stores so you don't hit fatigue during a training session. Now, the majority of training sessions are not going to deplete your carbohydrate stores. Typically, these become a thought when you're doing endurance training for longer than 60 minutes. When these become important tends to coincide when electrolytes become important. So oftentimes you'll see these as the same product, which can be, helpful in certain instances. But this can also be found solely as carbohydrates without the electrolytes. So the goo packs that, people use during, marathons, things like that are an example. As far as how much to take, the most common recommendation is 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour of exercise. So if you're going to do 2 hours of endurance training and you want to be at that low end, which is 30 grams per hour, you're going to look at 60 grams of carbohydrates taken throughout the duration of the session. And as far as kind of how to schedule that, so say you're going to do a 2-hour session and you're going to take 60 grams total, so you're at that kind of lower end. I would recommend taking your first 30-ish around minute 45 and your second 30 around 1 hour and 15 minutes in. But I mean, for different types of exercise, different durations, how you schedule it can go pretty deep, and that's kind of beyond the scope of what I want to cover in this video, but hopefully that gives you a decent idea. Now, as far as what to look for, not to put like in a carbohydrate supplement, ideally these supplement is going to have multiple different kinds of sugars in it that you're taking in. Reason being is so, for example, glucose is a sugar. Our glucose specific receptors in your intestine that, take up that glucose. If a product was only glucose, then those receptors might be saturated, for lack of a better word, and the glucose might hang around in the intestine while it waits for those receptors to open up so it can go in. Whereas if there were other kinds of sugars in the product and other receptors could be used, then there'd be less sugars hanging around in the intestine, and you're less likely to experience any sort of, stomach issues. And then lastly, I think this is worth saying for this kind of supplement, I always say test it before you trust it. So, sometimes certain products people do better with others. I don't really know a rhyme or reason why people do better with one over the other, but it's worth, trying a supplement out, seeing how your stomach does with it before you're 45 minutes away from your car and you take it down and your stomach starts to hurt and you're 45 minutes away. So having that foreknowledge that a specific product works well with you can be valuable. And this is a word vomit, but these are the references that I use to support everything I talked about in this video. I'm going to put links to all this stuff down below so that's easier. But with that said, that's everything I got for you today. So I hope you found that somewhat helpful, interesting, or somewhere between. If you got any questions or anything like that, drop them down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next time.